Hello guys, welcome back to another video. I'm your host Jibs from Riftlab, and today we will be covering the next starter deck guide in our series. This time we will be covering Lee Sin. Lee Sin is the third and final starter deck that you can get your hands on at your release events, and it's a fantastic way to start the game with quite a strong and tough high might deck. It uses a lot of spells and a lot of ways to buff its units through Lee Sin's ability. So let's cover the legend itself first. Lee Sin. So Lee Sin, a legend which allows you to tap him and pay 1 power to give a unit on your battlefield or base a buff. Now, a buff is a specific keyword in this game which gives a unit a permanent +1 might ability. It cannot be stacked unless the card specifically states that you can stack that keyword. So for those of you that play other games, when I refer to buff, you might think, oh, it's just a general buff from a spell. Well, in this specific game, a buff is a specific keyword which gives you +1 might, so bear that in mind. So on the screen now you can see the deck in its entirety of what you get in the starter deck. You'll get 3 Stalwart Poros, 3 Pit Rookies, 3 Wielder of Waters, 3 First Mates, 2 Charms, 3 Challenges, 2 Stand Uniteds, 2 Packer Clubs, 2 Bilgewater Bullies, 2 Stormclaw Ursines, 3 Disciplines, 3 Wildclaw Shamans, 1 Mask of Foresight, 2 Mountain Drakes, 3 Wizened Elders, 1 Mistfall and 1 Udyr Wildman, and finally the legend champion himself, Lee Sin. So let's start with the deck. I'll go through the deck in its entirety, what each card does, and then I'll go over some combos that the deck itself can do with the cards available to you. Now, at your starter events, or if you're growing a Lee Sin deck from the starter pack, I'll also cover some cards that you can look at purchasing later on to make the deck more competitive, and I'll also just cover a few cards that I suggest you put in if you find them in booster packs that you may get with the starter deck at your local store, or in the future. Let's say you buy like 5 or 6 packs, the chance of getting some of these cards are pretty high, so you can just slot them in straight away. So let's start with the deck itself and what you get. So I'll start with the low cost spells and units first. First of all, we have Charm. So Charm allows you to move an enemy unit. Very simple, 1 cost power and 1 recycle an energy of green, or calm for those that know. So pretty basic powerful spell that allows you to move an enemy unit to where you want. The way you can use this is to move an enemy back off a battlefield and then move over to conquer, or you can move an enemy into your own battlefield and hopefully take them out with buff spells or just your high might. So a really strong card. You'll probably keep these as well for future copies of this deck and competitive variations of this deck as well. Then we go straight to our low cost units. You've got 2 of them. You've got the Stalwart Poro and you have the Pit Rookie. Both really strong, no issues with either. Of course, you would want to start with the Poro. The reason being is the Pit Rookie has an effect which buffs another friendly unit, so you'd want another unit on the board first. But there's nothing wrong with playing it. It's a 2 might, 2 power cost unit. Both are nice. But of course, having a Poro in your hand early is the better start. Then we move on to some spells and gears. We've got Discipline, which gives a unit +2 might and allows you to draw a card. Fantastic card. I recommend keeping those in your deck and utilizing these in future decks. Then you've got Challenge, 2 cost action spell, which chooses a friendly unit and an enemy unit, and they deal damage to one another. Now, because this deck has quite a few high might units, this spell's very strong at dealing with enemy units you can't deal with. What you'll notice in this deck is it doesn't have spells like the Jinx deck might be able to hit another battlefield. This allows you to hit that battlefield with a high might unit that you might have in your base sitting ready to play, or in one of your conquered battlefields. Next, you've got Mask of Foresight. When a friendly unit attacks or defends, you have +1 might. Now, this is specific for when you trigger attack or defend. So if your opponent does play a spell and they're not attacking and you're not defending against attack, you do not get this. So it's specifically for combat triggers, so just bear that in mind. But it's still very strong gear. You can even open your play with this, just pop that down, ready for later on. Great card. Next, we've got a couple of units that are 3 cost. These are the Wielder of Water. So it's a 2 might unit for 3 power, and 3 energy. And what it does is, whilst he's attacking or defending, he gets +2 might. So you can play that into a battlefield as either the attacker or hold as a defender, and you'll be at 4 might total. And if you combine that with some other cards I've already mentioned, you can see that that might does increase quite quickly. But again, he is 2 might base just against spells or abilities, so again, bear that in mind. First mate, this card is a 3 cost and 3 might unit, again not burning any power, which is great. And when you play me, you ready another unit. Now this is great for a number of combos, which I will mention a little bit later in this video, but also a very strong card overall to have. And then you have the Packer Cub. He's not having a little rave. This is a hidden card, so it is just a 3 cost 3 might unit. And you can play it from hand if you need to, so it's giving you another unit that's fairly strong as a baseline, but you can play it as a hidden. So the hidden ability allows you to play it upside down, face down on a battlefield that you control, and then you can flip it up, and there you have a 3 might unit. Now what's great about this card is if your opponent moves into your battlefield, let's say you're playing a Victor and you have a Poro on your base and you play this as a hidden, the Victor could move its Victor champion in as a 4 might unit, and you have no spells in hand. You're thinking, how am I going to defend this? You can play this hidden card before you pass turn, and then your opponent has to think, right, how am I going to take this? Because that could be a number of different hidden cards that I know you have access to, or they might not know what you have access to, but in general, they should know that your deck does play a couple of hidden cards, especially if you've added a couple of cards as well from your booster deck. So it is a surprise factor. Boom, I'm not defending for 3, I'm actually defending for 6. So great card to have. Then you have another hidden card. So as I mentioned earlier, your deck does have a couple. Stand United. It is an action spell in general, so you can play this at action speed, or you can hide it, which reacts as a reaction speed, so you can play it straight away. And what it does is it buffs a friendly unit, and any buffs gives an additional +1 might to friendly units this turn. That does cover all units with buffs. Now, because Lee Sin's ability to buff a unit is a sort of ongoing passive, you could have a number of different units on the battlefield with a buff, and effectively those buffs are giving +2 instead of +1. So this is a great sort of aura buff, or spell should I say, and it also gives a buff to a friendly unit. So effectively it's giving a unit +2 might, and it keeps one of those for the rest of the game. So that could be quite a surprise factor if you're hiding it, or if you're just playing at action speed. It's a nice general spell to have in general. Then we have another gear. You've got Mistfall. So this card is one of the rares that you will get in the deck. Very nice shiny card. When you buff a friendly unit, you may pay a body rune and exhaust this to ready it. So what this means is you can have the gear up, you can recycle one of your orange runes, and then you get this tapped, so it exhausts itself, and then the unit that you target with this, so when you've buffed that unit, i.e. through the Lee Sin's ability, that unit becomes ready. So what's good about this is you can play this on your base, and then you could play a unit, let's just say for argument's sake, you play a Wielder of Water that comes in exhausted. You can buff it by tapping the Lee Sin's ability and paying 1 power, and then giving this a buff, and then you tap, recycling the rune with Mistfall, and then now this comes ready and then attacks. A little bit confusing, there's a lot going on, but it's a really good combo to have, so a great card in this deck specifically. Then we have Wizened Elder. So this is a 4 might unit. While I'm buffed, I have an additional +1 might. Great card. Probably one of the weaker ones to have in the entire deck, but it's okay. It is good when it does have a buff, but the way I look at it is to give it a buff, you're either paying another unit's sort of ability, so a Pit Rookie to give it a buff, or you're using the Lee Sin's legend ability, which is costing you a further 1 power. So if you're using that, the way I would look at this is the Wizened Elder is 5 power for 6 might, because he does go up to 6 might, but you are paying 5. So in most games that's pretty much your turn gone, unless you have like a 1 or 2 cost card in your hand. So in some situations it's pretty good, but having a 6 might unit in your deck is of course great to have. Then we've got the Wildclaw Shaman. This is another unit. When you play me, you may spend a buff to buff me and ready me. So it's a 4 cost 4 power unit for a 3 might, and when you spend someone else's buff, so for example, earlier on in the game, you've given a Pit Rookie, or sorry, you've played a Pit Rookie to give another unit a buff. You can then play this later on, and effectively it will be accelerated, because you can take that buff from, let's say, a Poro, give it to this, so now this becomes 4 might, and you have a 4 might accelerated unit for 4 cost, which is amazing. It's really good to have accelerated units in these decks, especially early on. However, saying that, accelerated units in sort of the mid game at only 4 might isn't great, but of course you can give this additional spell boosting effects, such as with your Discipline, your Mask of Foresight, which innately gives it +1. Then we get to the high-end cards. We'll look firstly at your Bilgewater Bully. This is a 6 cost, 6 might unit. While I'm buffed, I have ganking. Not bad. It's effectively 7 for 7. Again, it's pretty much your whole turn later on in the game where you're paying 7 power for a 7 might unit that innately will then have ganking, because you're again having to use the Lee Sin Legend to give it a buff. You don't have to. It's a 6 for 6 then. I'd say one of the weaker cards in the deck, but it's pretty high might, which again is pretty good. Next, you have another rare that you get in this deck. We have Udyr. So Udyr is in my opinion, one of the stronger high-end cards in this deck, because he has so much utility. Just by buffing him through the Lee Sin Legend ability, he gains access to quite a number of fantastic abilities that will come up throughout your game, and usually at specific times when you need it. You'll have to recycle one of your body runes, and he is a 6 power cost, but he is 6 might, and for that you gain a number of abilities when you buff him. So again, I guess he's 7 cost, because you'd probably be buffing him when you play him, because then he could spend his buff for these different abilities. So you could choose one that you've not chosen this turn. So actually you could do this multiple times if you have different ways to buff him on the same turn. Deal 2 damage. It doesn't say damage, but it says just deal 2 to a unit at a battlefield. So effectively that is damage. You're damaging someone by 2. Of course, if it's just a 2 might unit, you could end up killing it. Or if it's a quite high might unit, it's a way to deal with it with another unit that you have access to later on. You can stun a unit at a battlefield. Again, fantastic way of dealing with a combat, because you could utilize this buff at any point. So you can go in, spend the buff, and then now you've stunned that unit, which really helps overcome because they're not damaging you. So if you're worried, okay, they could use abilities to buff themselves, let's just stun him, then it's great. You can ready himself, so you can burn that buff, get rid of it, and then now you have a 6 might unit which is ready, again accelerated, which is great to have access to. And the final ability is ganking. So ganking is quite an underrated ability. If this unit is holding on a battlefield at 7 might, you know, your opponent can't deal with that, because you again have all these abilities to keep it safe. Next turn, you don't want to commit another unit over the other side. You want to keep your units safe in your base. You can burn that buff on the Udyr, move across to the other battlefield, conquer that, and then you could use the Lee Sin's ability to buff the Udyr and potentially then spend his buff again, ready himself, and then move back to base to keep him safe. So there's some nice little jank that you can do with this card. I think it's great to have in this deck. And now we're down to the last two. We've got Stormclaw Ursine, apologies if that's the incorrect way to say it. This looks like a little Volibear here. When you play me, channel 1 rune exhausted, and it has the tank keyword. So the tank keyword does come up if you want to hold with multiple units. This is a 6 might unit for 7 power cost, and you don't have to recycle anything. And this allows you to ramp up your runes by channeling 1 rune, which is nice. Which helps to gain access to even higher cost units, which I'll go into your highest cost unit in a moment. But it also has the tank keyword. So if you have another unit you want to protect, let's say you've got a Wielder of the Water on a battlefield, you can put this down and go, well, you have to deal with this 6 might unit first before you can assign any combat damage to the Wielder, because I'm worried about this card, I want to keep it safe. Or perhaps even an Udyr. You know, you don't have a buff on the Udyr, you can't protect it, you don't have any spells in hand. Okay, you know what, I'll play the Stormclaw on that battlefield. You now have to deal with that first, because it has the tank keyword. Again, remember, this is only combat damage that tanks tank for you. Okay, and then finally, Mountain Drake. It's a 9 power for 10 might unit. Doesn't recycle any runes, which is great. And this is your sort of final boss. Things to be aware of with this card, though, is because it is high cost, that is going to be your whole turn. When you play it, make sure you're playing it in a safe spot. when you're playing against opponents like Victor, where they have access to kill spells, such as Hidden Blade and Call the Weak, you need to make sure you have some kind of defenses for them. So for example, Hidden Blade can only be played on a battlefield. Do I want to play this on a battlefield with no ways to stop my opponent doing that? Or a Call the Weak, you can pick another unit. So make sure you have another low might unit, such as a Poro at the back, so you can protect this unit. And finally, we have the champion unit, Lee Sin, centered himself. So Lee Sin has the accelerate ability. I've covered that numerous times in this guide, where having an accelerated unit can be quite powerful in conquering a battlefield when you need. You will have to pay an additional power and recycle a body rune as an additional cost to have him enter ready. And his second ability is other buffed friendly units at my battlefield have +2. Now let's cover the battlefields that you get with the starter deck. First of all, you get access to Monastery of Hirana. If you burn your buff, you get to draw a card. So get rid of your buff, get to draw a card. Fantastic ability. This allows you to get through your deck and find those spells or units that you desperately need for the matchup. And sometimes you don't necessarily need a buff on the unit that's there, or you can simply play another buff from the Lee Sin's ability. So a great battlefield to have. Next, we have Targon's Peak, which when you conquer at the end of your turn, you're ready 2 runes. This works in conjunction with the numerous spells that you do have. Perhaps one of the weaker battlefields though, because some of your opponents could utilize this better than you. And then finally, the third battlefield that you have access to is Grove of the Godwillow. So Grove of the Godwillow, whilst you're holding, you'll get to draw an additional card. So at the beginning of your next turn, if you're still holding Grove of the Godwillow, you can draw a card. Great battlefield because this deck's biggest strength is holding onto battlefields. So I would keep this for sure. So whilst we are on the topic of battlefields, our next subject is going to be the cards that I suggest looking out for and replacing some of the cards that you get in the deck. So in terms of the battlefields, I think the first one you'd want to look out for is Windswept Hillock. Units here have ganking. So because you have access to numerous high might units and also further units that I will cover in a moment, this battlefield is fantastic at unlocking some of those units' strengths, which they don't currently have inbuilt, which is the ganking keyword. Now, although some of your units do have ganking, having access to that ganking capability is brilliant because you could be holding that, move straight over without having to sacrifice other units in your deck. Another one I would look at is Aspirant's Climb. Aspirant's Climb increases the number of points needed to win by 1, which means you and your opponent need to get to 9 rather than 8 points to win. Now this effectively extends the game length, and since this deck gets stronger the longer the game goes, because more and more units have buffs, you get more high might units on the board, which are difficult for your opponent to deal with. I think that's a great battlefield to have access to. And finally, one that I may consider instead of especially Targon's Peak would be the Dreaming Tree. Since you have a number of spells that target your own units, and I will be going over a few more spells that you could potentially add to this deck, Dreaming Tree unlocks the capability of drawing even more cards and gaining access to those units or spells that you desperately may need. So those are the battlefields that I would certainly look at. Let's look at some body runed orange colored cards that I would look at adding to my deck if I was playing Lee Sin. Let's look at Confront. So Confront is an action spell at 2 cost. Units you play this turn enter ready. Draw 1. So this has 2 parts to it. Not only do further units you play that turn enter ready, which is already great, you also draw a card. So it can be really helpful. Again, there's lots of abilities that I'm talking about drawing cards. I think drawing cards in this game is really strong because you want as many options as you can to win the game rather than just the ones you're drawing off the top of your deck. So having another ability to draw is great. Another low cost unit that you could add is Synthria of Cloudfield. It's only a 2 cost 1 might unit. When you play another unit, buff me. This is one of those units that you can play at the beginning of the game, and it's a great starter. Although it's low might, every time you play a unit, you buff this, and that could be great on Monastery of Hirana. Another unit is Kinku Monk. When you play me, buff 2 friendly units. It is a 4 might unit, and you do have to recycle one of your orange body runes. However, it is great to spread those buffs around when and where needed. Another unit that you could look at getting is Carnivorous Snapvine. When you play me, choose an enemy unit at a battlefield and we deal damage to our might to each other. Now, notably, this triggers when you play the unit. So you cannot buff the unit innately because you will be playing it and you just do 6 damage to your opponent there and then. But as long as you play it correctly, fantastic ability to have. If your opponent does react to this, you can then react to them by playing a buff, which is great. So yeah, it works in conjunction with other spells to potentially get this to like 8 might with a discipline, for example. Another card is Wallop. This is a spell, action speed. As you play this, you may spend a buff as an additional cost. If you do, ignore the spell cost. So again, going back to Synthria, you could have this low cost, low might unit where you get rid of that buff and get this card effectively for free. And what it does is it readies a unit. So if you need to play on a ganking unit, you can push it in, ready it with Wallop, gank across, or again with the Windswept Hillock battlefield, which I mentioned earlier. Having access to all your units, gaining the ganking keyword on that battlefield means that you can play the Wallop, move across, and conquer both battlefields. So really, really strong card. And then finally, I wanted to cover Dragon's Rage. This is the signature spell for Lee Sin. Beautiful card. This allows you to move an enemy unit, then you choose another enemy unit at its destination and they deal damage equal to their mights to one another. This is one of the few ways and one of the strongest signature spells in my opinion to deal with units you cannot personally deal with. Okay, so for example, you're playing against Jinx. They have a, let's say, a 4 might unit on a battlefield, and then there's a Vi sitting in their base. You're a bit concerned about that Vi buffing itself up to like 8 might and then pushing in. What you can do is you can move that unit on the battlefield back to base, or back to their base, using Dragon's Rage, and then they do damage equal to their might to one another, and you can kill that Vi. Of course, if both those units are 3 might, they end up killing one another, but if it's a high might one, it's still a great card to be able to extend and deal with. And that goes with challenge as well, to deal with those pesky cards at the back. There's a numerous different ways I'm sure you guys can think about that this card is great at. Bear in mind, when you move a unit, you can move them across to another battlefield. So if your opponent has 2 5 might units on each battlefield, you can move one across with Dragon's Rage and they kill each other. So really strong ability there. So that's it for the body runes. There are numerous other cards that you could add, but those are the sort of pertinent ones that I like the look of, that add a lot of value to this deck. Now we're going to look at the calm runes, the green units and spells that I think you should look at. So we'll start with the low end. Let's go first of all with the spell Unguard. It's a reaction speed, so you can always utilize this, and it gives a friendly unit +1 might this turn, but an additional +1 might if it's the only unit you control there. So since this deck utilizes a lot of high might units, you don't tend to have numerous massed units holding battlefields. This is a great spell to have access to. The second one is Rune Prison. It's an action speed, stuns a unit, and it doesn't deal damage that turn. So if you feel like you cannot deal with an enemy unit that's coming in, you can simply stun them and they'll move back. The same again if you move into a battlefield and they decide, your opponent decides to use some spells to buff that unit and you can't deal with it, you can stun it, doesn't do any damage, and your unit safely comes back to base. The next one, Zonya's Hourglass. This is a really shiny rare that we love the look of. Yeah, I wouldn't say it's too common, but it is a great card to get access to. It is a gear, and a hidden gear at that, which is one of very few, and effectively it keeps a unit alive. So the next time a friendly unit would die, kill this instead, recall that unit exhausted, so you send it to base. You can play this hidden. Now again, with the hidden cards you get in this deck, your opponent might not really know what it could be. The first time, for example, it's a cub, they're going to think, oh, it's a cub, I need to play around that. And when in fact it's just keeping your unit alive, especially your high might units later on in the game, which you want to keep, and things like Lee Sin Champion itself. Great card to add. Another unit that I want to look at in this deck is Sona Harmonious. While I'm at a battlefield, ready for friendly runes at the end of your turn. This is situational. It is a 4 power 4 might unit where you have to recycle 1 calm rune. Although you can buff it to 5 might, it is still a low might unit. However, what you can do is at the end of your turn, when you do ready 4 runes, you could utilize those 4 runes to either protect the Sona or protect other units in your deck. So I'd say it's a pretty fantastic combo with some of the spells you have. And then I've got 2 more cards to add potentially, one of which actually is a body rune and one of which is a calm rune. And these are sort of special cards that if you can find them or potentially spend a bit of money on, you can really elevate this deck to another level. The first one is Dead Bloom Predator. This is a really cool card, very strong. It's an 8 might unit and it has the deflect keyword, and when you play me, you can play me to an occupied enemy battlefield, and it has the deflect keyword, which your opponent must pay an additional rune when they choose a spell or ability that targets your Dead Bloom Predator. Effectively, if your opponent is holding a battlefield, you can play this straight away. Effectively, it's an accelerated unit that goes straight into that battlefield at 8 might. Of course, when you do that, you can't then buff it. However, you can use spells on it, so you can get it to 10 might, etc. Now, when you are holding, after hopefully you've conquered, you can then buff it with the Lee Sin's ability, and that gives it a really strong 9 might. And of course, if you have things like a Mask of Foresight in your base, it's 11 might defending, so really difficult for your opponent to deal with. And then finally, I want to talk about the White Flame Protector. Again, 8 might as well, but when you play me, give a unit plus 8 might this turn. Now, with the number of low might units that you have in this deck, later on in the game you can play this, and if you have one of those sitting about, your opponent's going to think, okay, what buffs does he have? Does he have a way of buffing this to like 4, 6? No, I'm going to buff this to 10. And again, I'm using the buff keyword. What I mean is, of course, an increase to its might through an ability, a spell. But yeah, with this specifically is a ability which gives even itself plus 8 might that turn, which doesn't necessarily come into play too often. However, one combo you could look at is with Mistfall. You give the White Flame Protector its plus 8 might ability. You then give it a buff, and then you can use the Mistfall's ability to tap itself and then ready up the White Flame Protector. Now, that is a lot of recycling and power cost for that turn, but it is something late game that you could consider. Now, with these 2 cards, they are certainly on the top end. If you want to add these, you certainly can, but don't feel like you have to. Okay, there's other cards that you can add and take out of this deck. Now, some of the cards that I've mentioned here are effective with this deck in its entirety. However, there's some cards in this deck I would look to swap out for those cards. So first of all, I would look at taking out the Bilgewater Bullies. They're not great, they're okay. At their sort of cost, I would look at swapping them for that sort of same cost area rather than a low or super high cost. Okay, then I would look at dropping the Wildclaw Shamans. Again, they're low cost, but not great in this deck. I would prefer, you know, another spell such as the Unguard or Wallops, something like that to really look at replacing. I would potentially look at trying to get more Mask of Foresights. I would try and get that to like at least 2 in the deck. You could look at the ratios, so perhaps instead of 2 Mountain Drakes, you could take 1, and then if you do have 1 Dead Bloom, you can add that. So try and keep it roughly to the same level. Let's go over how you actually play all this in conjunction, and I'll cover this briefly as I don't want to keep you here all day. The deck itself wants to ramp up to a good state where you're playing these high might units. So early game, you want to play your low might units, get board control and keep them safe. So play your masks, play your buffs where needed, but try not to waste them, okay? Try not to use your Lee Sin ability at every opportunity. Sometimes you can look at a board state and go, you know what? These units are not going to survive even if I buff it. I don't have to. But actually, by keeping 1 or 2 runes up, your opponent may have to think extra hard because they might be thinking, what else does he have in play? On the mid game, you want to then reconsolidate your battlefield. So once you get to 3 or 4 points and you've got 7 runes in hand at play, that's when you want to start thinking, how can I get to the end game and get these high might units up? By playing units like the Stormclaw Ursine, which gives you a rune exhausted, that gives you a way of getting to the late game. But you also want to protect your units as well. So think about things like Challenge and Charm, which can deal with those enemy units that you couldn't otherwise deal with at the back of the board. That's really important, okay? I see a lot of players utilizing these spells early that they might not see again. So don't think you have to charm everything, okay? You do have 2 in this deck. You could look at adding a 3rd, but I like the 2, okay? If you have 1 in hand, keep it there ready for an important moment. Don't just throw it away just because you want to get that point. Utilize it later on, which could save you the game, or really consolidate a strong hold. So you have an 8 might unit on a battlefield, then you know you can deal with that enemy unit on the other battlefield straight away with a charm, and then move a low might unit such as a Poro or a Pit Rookie over there later on. And finally, don't throw away your Lee Sin. What I see some players doing is they get to that 7 rune level where they have 7 power available on their turn, and they'll accelerate Lee Sin just to conquer a battlefield and leave it there unprotected. Lee Sin centered is he's a support champion, so he needs that support around him. So if you just play that with no other units that are already buffed, or you don't have spells to protect him, it feels like a waste. So make sure that when you are playing him, sometimes you don't need to accelerate. You can play him on a battlefield where you have another unit buffed, and he can enhance that unit further. So really utilize him well. And Udyr is the final boss, which utilizes all his different abilities through the buff effect. So don't utilize him unless you're really getting the most out of it, and think about how you want to use Udyr. Okay, he could be used as a ganking tool, he could be used to do that additional damage that you need, but yeah, with all his abilities, he's multi-toolbox there for you to utilize. So really think about how you're going to use him to maximize the effectiveness of this deck. That's the guide in its entirety. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope this gave you enough tools to get you to a really good level on utilizing the Lee Sin champion deck. I'm sure you'll enjoy it just as much as I enjoyed covering this today. Let me know how you guys are getting on with this deck and what cards you think are a great tool to add to this deck down below. We do read every comment and we appreciate your time writing them. Thanks again. Make sure you're following and subscribing to the channel. As we release more content, you can be notified. And thanks again. Enjoy your Riftbound games. This is Jibs. I'll catch you later.